As we come back to the discussion and switch gears, I'm going to take a moment to say that I haven't been to PONARS in a couple of years. I try to only come when I have something to say. But it's been a real pleasure, and I'm reminded about what a wonderful organization it is, and I've learned a lot both from speakers and audiences, so I wanted to express my thanks to all of you, and in particular to Henry, Corey, and the PONARS team. So we're also switching gears and topics to talk now about political economy in general. So you're looking at three people, and Alexei Navalny, who think that politics are going to be, economics will be important again soon. And it's something we're talking about. So Ted Gerber will kick off the discussion, talking about housing political grievances in 4 post-Soviet states.
Right.
Is it comparative?
Not really. I'm actually a Russianist who's discovering the value of some comparison. So thank you very much for sharing your lunchtime with our session. As Regina mentioned, this study is about the relationship between housing and political grievances. And it's sort of taking a longer-term picture. It's joint work with Jane Zaviska, who's also a sociologist at the University of Arizona. And basically, the intuition that motivated this project was that housing issues might well be an important but somewhat underappreciated source of political grievances in former Soviet republics. Housing is important for a number of reasons. It has important demographic consequences. It affects people's decisions about marriage, childbearing, residential mobility, labor market participation, labor supply, all kinds of things. It also potentially has repercussions of a political nature. It could affect people's what we call political grievances, by which we mean specifically grievances towards the state. We also argue it could affect social grievances, grievances against other groups of society, it could affect ideology, it could affect civic participation. But today the focus is on political grievances. So why do we think that in former Soviet countries housing might be a source of political grievance? Well, it has to do with the combination of the Soviet housing redistribution, or Soviet housing distribution system and development since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in the Soviet Union, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, housing was allocated for the most part by the state to people. People were given flats to live in on the basis of queues and waiting lists. And there was a complex system of queues. There was, different modes of distribution through employers or through employee firms, through local government and so forth. But in contrast to Western societies or long-term developed capitalist societies where people's housing in a large part is a function of the wealth of their families, which gives them access to down payments, it gives them the finances to purchase housing. The Soviet Union people were given housing if they just waited long enough. So what that means is that, it means several things. For one thing, it means that the former Soviet countries are a great place to study the effects of housing because in contrast to Western societies where there are so many unobservable variables correlated with housing that are also correlated with the outcomes that we're usually looking at, housing distribution was more exogenous to those outcomes in the Soviet system. Moreover, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, housing was privatized, and the way housing privatization worked varied from country to country, but for the most part, housing was just given to people. If they filled out some paperwork, they became the owners of their housing. So that took what was an exogenous distribution of access to housing to an exogenous distribution of housing wealth, which is quite neat. You can think of it as a quasi-natural experiment. However, the idea behind housing privatization was that it would stimulate the formation of housing markets and that you'd have a transition to a market-based allocation of housing. It hasn't really worked out that well in most of the post-Soviet countries. There's been a dearth of new construction, so what was already a shortage-like condition with respect to housing remains such. The banking systems evolved in these countries not in such a way as to have mortgage lending become a central part of their activity, so people have not had access to credit or to mortgages to buy housing, and as a result the market has been very tight. There in many countries been a complex system of property rights. So, for example, there's still some remnants of a registration or a propiska-like system in these countries, and often if people are registered in a particular home, the owner cannot sell that home without the permission of the people who are registered there. So that's another constraint on the free flowing of the market. As a result of this poor development of the housing market, multi-generational or extended family co-residence is still quite common in all these countries. It varies, in Russia it's certainly not a norm. It's not that people want to be living with their grandparents or with their in-laws, it's just that the housing constraints make it necessary to do so. And again, another reason that makes this interesting is we see, as a result of all this problem with the tight housing market, we see a lot of cases of what we would call housing inconsistency or status inconsistency based on housing. So often people who have high status jobs, they still simply don't make enough money to actually buy a house on the market. So they're living in very constrained housing conditions with their in-laws. Whereas people who are relatively poor, they happen to be living, they happen to live in a family, which happen to have a house, apartment allocated to them in the Soviet system, which now is worth $1 million. So you have a lot of status inconsistency. All right, so what is this all together? So our argument, in essence, boils down to this, that the post-Soviet experience has led to a lot of dissatisfaction with housing. There's a lot of people in these countries who are unhappy with their housing situation. And the legacy of the Soviet Union is that people still expect, we think, that the government is responsible for providing the housing. There's a lot of people unhappy with their housing everywhere, lots of people in the United States. But in the United States, nobody thinks that the government should be providing them with housing. Or at least that they do, they're probably not in the mainstream, shall we say. So basically the argument is this combination of widespread dissatisfaction with housing, plus a sense that the government is somehow responsible. It should translate housing dissatisfaction into grievances against the government much more smoothly or much more directly in former Soviet countries than we see elsewhere. There is some anecdotal for this. So our 4 countries of study are Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Uzbekistan. And so I'll just give you a few little factoids. So we have, in Azerbaijan, there's not a whole lot of political protests against the government, but there have been some protests about eminent domain issues. The government in Azerbaijan, when it's built new facilities for Eurovision and so forth, it's taken over entire neighborhoods, keep people out of the house, they're unhappy about the compensation they receive. So there's been some protest activity over that. Also in Russia, there have been some protests over the same sorts of issues, but also there's this movement of Bolsheviki, over people who pooled together their resources and spent money, invested money in housing. They gave money to developers, but then the developers ran off with the money. And they actually think the government should pay them back for the risk that they took in investing in these shady development schemes. And so that's also another example of how ultimately all this could redound back on the government. In Kyrgyzstan, land distribution is being a big issue, a big source of conflict, actually violent conflict even. And there's also controversies over the so-called Novostroyki, which in the Kyrgyz context refers to squatter settlements near Bishkek, where people come in and seize these new apartment buildings and demanded services and actually receive them. Ukraine housing has not been so much in the news because other things have been more pressing, shall we say. But one consequence of the recent conflict is a surge of IDPs as a result of that clock was moving really fast. I'm not speaking that fast. So the IDPs are likely to exacerbate the housing crisis. Okay, but we have here a question aside from these anecdotes. How important really are housing problems in public opinion? How widespread is the view that the government is responsible for providing housing? Is there still, like I see, 25 years have gone by since the Soviet Union collapsed. Maybe people have shifted their perspectives. And then finally, does dissatisfaction with housing, does that translate into less support for incumbent governments? So we're going to answer this with quantitative data. I'm not going to go through all this, but first of all, I need to acknowledge that this research is supported by the Minerva Initiative grant from the U.S. Department of Defense, administered by the U.S. Army Research Office. We did this survey in Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Ukraine, as I mentioned. 18 to 49-year-olds are our population of interest. I could talk more about the methodology of the study, but basically in each country we have random samples, or not random, but probability samples representative of the entire population 18 to 49 years old, equal to about 2,000. In Azerbaijan, we couldn't get into the rural areas, so Azerbaijan is an urban-only sample. The others are both urban and rural. And we also have oversamples in each country. So in Russia, we oversampled 4 Muslim republics or regions. In Ukraine, we oversampled mortgagers. They're excluded from this analysis because of our sampling approach was totally different for them, so it's not really appropriate to combine them. In Azerbaijan, we oversampled IDPs, and then in Kyrgyzstan, we oversampled in regions with a recent history of ethnic violence. We used post-sampling weights to correct for the disproportionate representation of these groups. And all the surveys were conducted earlier this year, so it's pretty fresh data. Okay, so let's go through the issues one at a time. What is the relative importance of housing? We started, our very first question of the survey asked people to indicate which of the following set of issues they consider to be the most important. And in all countries, people's family, the material well-being of people, the respondents' family came out number 1. In 3 of the 4, housing came out number 2. In Ukraine is the only exception. So here's the response distributions. You can see the categories. So in Russia, 17% cited housing issues. Ukraine only 6%. So there, it came in second. The political military conflict, which is certainly understandable. In Azerbaijan, housing actually came ahead. Despite the importance of Nagorno-Karabakh within Azerbaijani society, housing still came in a bare second place. And in Kyrgyzstan, it's actually almost rivals family's material situation. So, housing is more of a concern in most of these places than health and family issues, lack of free time, lack of education, even political and military conflict. Clearly, it's a pretty important issue. It ranks high in people's concerns. So who do people see as responsible? We ask, who's responsible for providing young families with housing? Should it be young families themselves? Should it be their parents? Should it be the government or other? And actually nowhere, despite our hopes and our expectations, nowhere is it a majority of people who see the government as responsible. And yet it is a fairly substantial number. So in Russia, about 28%, Ukraine, 23%, Azerbaijan, 36%. That's the highest. It's the lowest in Kyrgyzstan, interestingly enough. And our explanation of this is the Kyrgyz have largely given up on the government, providing them with much of anything. It's a very weak and ineffective state. And so, but in Kyrgyzstan, they think parents are primarily responsible. And we saw a lot of evidence of that in the focus groups. It's just basically the expectation that the parents of the groom in particular are to provide housing for the son and the bride. Okay, but still substantial minorities, large minorities in all countries except for maybe Kyrgyzstan. What about housing satisfaction and ownership? Well, actually we see more satisfaction, less dissatisfaction than we expected, but still a substantial amount. There's most dissatisfaction with housing in Azerbaijan. Now we have extensive measures of quality of housing. Eventually we're going to parse through those and see how those are related to our variables of interest. But we see this subjective satisfaction with housing as a key variable that sort of brings together all the different qualities of housing that affect people's satisfaction. And so it's a good sort of first brush proxy. Also home ownership. So there's a lot of theory that suggests that homeowners are different. Home ownership itself gives people a basis of confidence, a long-term time horizon, and investment in the status quo. And so we think that homeowners should be more supportive of the current authorities. And the home ownership rate, as you see, it's about almost 50% in Russia. These are individual owners, so we distinguish between individual. It's lowest in Azerbaijan, but there's a reason for that. So in Azerbaijan, it's difficult to put more than one person's name on the official title. It requires a lot of paperwork, and so a lot of people don't bother re-registering the title when they inherit the homes. Okay. So here's the dissatisfaction. So in Russia, only 23% are either completely or somewhat dissatisfied with their current housing situation, which struck us as surprisingly low. Even lower in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan. It's not that people are completely satisfied, but we see more satisfaction than we expected, quite frankly. So that's kind of interesting. All right, punchline, statistical analyses. So what do? We have 3 measures of government support. One simple question that's used throughout the world: is the country headed in the right direction? And the idea is if people think the country's headed in the right direction, it's implicitly support the authorities without asking them directly that. Then we had a question: does the government respond to the needs of the population, or do you agree with the following statement? The government responds to the needs of the population. And then we have measures of trust in a number of institutions. These 4 actually scale together quite nicely. That is the president, the parliament, the police, and the courts. And we create an additive scale by integer coding the responses and taking the average. So we estimate regression models. I'm going to show you OLS results because they're very simple to interpret. We did use as robustness checks, use the appropriate ordinal logit models. The results are the same, but the OLS results are easier to interpret because it gives an intuitive meaning to the effects of our 2 variables, as we'll see. So we specify housing using 2 dummy variables, one just denoting people who are dissatisfied either somewhat or completely with their housing, and then one for home ownership. And we control in all the models for age, for gender, for education, family income, quintile, and urban residence. So we got a lot of nice controls in there. What do we find? So what we find is that we have consistent and fairly substantial effects of housing dissatisfaction on support for the authorities. And the more dissatisfied people are, the more likely they are to have a lower estimation of trust, or lower trust in the authorities, lower support for the authorities. We also find consistent positive effects on support for the authorities in all the countries except for Azerbaijan, and that kind of makes sense in light of the fact I just mentioned that how Azerbaijan, the individual ownership measure is not a good measure. You know, we do have household level ownership measures which we'll use, and I think should bear fruit. So here's our numbers, and I don't know if you can see those, or probably some of you can, some of you can't. So in each panel, you have the mean of the scale in question. They all run from 1 through 5. So higher scores on these scales denote more support for the authorities, and it's country by country. So Russia has generally the highest level of support for the authorities, also very high in Azerbaijan. Tends to be lowest in Ukraine, actually, which is kind of interesting. And I've given you the standard deviations here, and the reason why, so those are the standard deviations of the scale, and you can use those to interpret the magnitude of these effects. So the effects in bold give you the effects of W variables, and what that means is, controlling for all those other variables in the model, as people of the same age, the same gender, the same family income, the same education, the same type of residence, whether or not they're dissatisfied with their home has this effect on their predicted value of the dependent variables. So what this shows you, and they're all statistically significant if they're up there. So what this shows you, for all three measures, all 4 countries, as 12 models, we have statistically significant effect of dissatisfaction with housing on the dependent variable. So clearly that's very strong, consistent. And also, the standard deviations are all about 1.0 for the dependent variables. And you can see, so roughly speaking, the size of those values gives you how much of a standard deviation that difference is. And it ranges from about 20% of a standard deviation to about half or more, which is pretty substantial in terms of the effect of one single variable. The ownership variable, so as I mentioned, not significant at all in Azerbaijan, not significant with respect to our scale in Ukraine, but significant everywhere else, somewhat smaller in magnitude. Okay, so this is really, as a first brush, it's a pretty strong and consistent set of findings, suggesting that housing dissatisfaction, on the one hand, lowers support for the regimes in these countries, and home ownership actually tends to be associated with higher levels of support. So, now, I have to start with the conclusion of the caveat, of course, if there's any economist in the room, or social science, or political scientist too, you're immediately going to say, well, what about endogeneity? And it could be that there's some unobserved characteristic. So perhaps people are cranky. People who are cranky are less likely to be satisfied with their housing, and also less likely to be satisfied with their government. So the associations that we've identified could have nothing to do, no causal relationship, but it could just be that there's some unobserved variables, and that the relationship is endogenous. Well, that's certainly possible. We do have some variables for you techies out there. We do have some variables we are planning to use to instrument for home ownership in particular, but also for housing satisfaction. That's a more involved analysis. This is really our first pass into data. I did throw in, as a robustness check, a measure of general life satisfaction. So we have a measure of satisfaction with housing. Later in the survey, we asked people how satisfied are you with life in general. So if you throw that in, that would, in principle, control for that unobserved, basic, orientation. Are people happy? Are they sad? Are they cynical or pessimistic? Or are they, bleeding heart optimists? And that is encouraging that when you control for that, still most of the effects remain significant. A few of them drop out. It's a very conservative test. That's why I don't actually report those results, because life satisfaction in general could also be a function of housing. It could actually just be translating or mediating some of those housing effects. But that initial check anyway is encouraging. Overall, we have very strong and consistent results, and so we think at least so far we're encouraged that we may be onto something here. That dissatisfaction with housing is indeed associated with more critical orientations towards the government in these countries, and that home ownership, in contrast, is linked with more positive views. So it's also noteworthy overall because there's most dissatisfaction with housing in Azerbaijan, and the effects are pretty much the same across countries, that housing has the greatest potential to produce criticism of the government in Azerbaijan. Least so in Ukraine. Again, I think that could be a function of the current circumstance, which so much else is going on in Ukraine, that housing is just temporarily perhaps receded in terms of the salience as an issue. But by and large, I think these findings do suggest that the governments of these regions should be aware. They should take action to address the housing shortages, the poorly functioning housing markets, that really is a potential sore point for the populations, apart from the economic crisis, apart from geopolitical conflicts, apart from nationalism, apart from all of the other things we've been discussing in the last few days. In the medium to long term, these housing issues could really come home to roost. And the governments have lots of incentives to address housing, especially to deal with things like fertility crisis, breakdown in marriage, and so forth. But what our findings suggest so far, anyway, is that the potential political repercussions of not dealing with the housing crisis redound on the government and in these countries, and therefore they would be they would serve their own interests well by addressing them more effectively. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Gulnaz Sharafutdinova will speak about economic crisis, regional finance, and federal response in Russia. You're going to speak from that.
Yes, am I heard? Ted, easier said than done. That would be my immediate gut reaction to your
Dealing with
suggestion.
the housing crisis.
Right. So my memo addresses the issue of regional difficulties, to put it mildly, growing in Russia's regions, and the nature of federal and regional response, and maybe some observations of popular reaction. Let me start with a short story. Many of you must have noticed that the 2015 started with some troublesome signals in the regions, regional public in many places like Kaluga, Ryol, Tver, Tula, Bryansk, Kursk, woke up to have their suburban trains, electrichki, canceled overnight. I could probably compare it to tube strikes in London, but maybe it won't be quite an accurate comparison because of all the alternative means of transportation that exist in London. And if you are living in your dacha or in suburban villages and towns, that pretty much means that you are cut off, whether of your school, university, potential job, or hospital. Basically, your life is really disrupted. So the nature of Putin's reaction is very telling. He basically practically said, literally said, "Вы что, с ума сошли?" to the officials who decided to cancel these trains. Are you out of your mind? And the decisions to cancel these trains were reversed very quickly. I use this little story to indicate basically the looming financial crisis in the regions, and to illustrate that this is just one of the signs of the fact that regional governments are not able to really meet their financial obligations, and that regional budgets have been in a growing crisis. Just to give you some hard facts, by July 2015, the regional indebtedness, so the debt of regional budgets equaled 2.12 trillion rubles, which is around 35 to 37 billion dollars, depending on, I think I calculated this a few weeks ago. And only 3 regions, Sakhalin, Sevastopol, and Nenetsky Okrug, lacked any debt. So all the budgets are extremely indebted. The biggest regional debt holders in nominal terms are usually stronger regions like Krasnodar, Krai, Tatarstan, Moscow Oblast, regions that have borrowed a lot to support various, frequently mega projects that they have taken on. But in the growing number of regions, the debt level have reached, Chukotka at some point had a debt level of 144% relative to its budget. Now it's about 125. Mordovia, Smolensk, Kostroma, Karelia, Udmurtia, debt levels are really, really high. So pretty much majority of regions are both in debt and face budget deficits, which by 2014-15 are about reaching about 500 billion rubles. The origins of these problems are not very new. They are not directly coming out of the sanctions or counter-sanctions. And the origins are usually leading to the beginning of Putin's presidency and his decrees in May that basically mandated regional governments to raise salaries for public employees and to keep salaries and pensions adjusted to inflation. These decrees were monitored pretty carefully, and governments that didn't have money to meet these demands basically had to go out and borrow money from sometimes from the federal budget, lobbying the federal government for budgetary credits, but frequently from commercial banks. And the terms on which they borrow this money differ. The budgetary credits are pretty much free, 0.1% interest rate. To borrow from commercial banks is really, really expensive, 12, 14, 16%, depending on their bargaining powers, etc., and relationship with these banks. Usually commercial borrowing is done on a short-term basis, so you have to return it pretty quickly. Now, what's the consequence of this is that many regions are facing a situation of potential defaults. And there was a case already in February when Novgorod Oblast was not able to return its money on time. And now, most commentators agree that these defaults will not happen and the federal government will rush to help and save the regional governments from such defaults by trying to restructure commercial debts into budgetary credit, debt to the federal budget rather than to commercial banks. But this situation with that has not been really improving, but the federal government's attention to it has, it has caught the eye and the attention of the federal government. So there has been sort of initiatives and communication and sort of measures to not face situation of financial defaults of the regions. Besides. So on the one hand, we have the situation of increasing social obligations of the regional governments. On the other hand, we have really decreasing revenues. Russian economy started stagnating, also not in 2014, but earlier, 2013 usually is indicated as the date of economic downturn already. So the regional budgets that rely on corporate profits or personal income tax, they are getting less and less just base revenues from the regions. At the same time, the degree of federal transfers into the region that have been growing over the 2000s has been also dropping with the high level reached in 2009. Since then, they have been dropping. So regional governments really found themselves in this new survival mode, sort of changing from the expansion rhetoric, from big projects rhetoric to really survival mode and tightening the belts type policies. How do we see this happening and what are some policy reactions on the regional side? They are pressured by the Ministry of Finance to cut their spending, and spending cuts started in 2013 already, usually with the spending into the economic infrastructural projects, road building. So if you visit various regions, you will see that the roads are not being really fixed and the maintenance is really bad. But from the new aspects of spending cuts, from 2014, more and more regions started to cut social spending on education, spending on healthcare, and we have these massive optimization projects, again relaunched by the Ministry of Finance to optimize healthcare system, to optimize education system. What does that mean? Again, you've probably seen the news and some protest activities around these issues, that many hospitals are being closed, universities, schools are being closed, and we're not only talking about hospitals or some ambulatory points in little towns and villages, but also, sometimes hundreds of these organizations in Moscow. So there are very clear consequences and social consequences. Besides that, there is also another, talking about housing and the communal utilities, there is some features reminding the 1990s when there were non-payments for electricity or gas. You have these debts growing both on the residential but also on the commercial, from the commercial enterprises. So, Gazprom is not getting its bills paid. Okay, I am almost at the end. So, the last point of the memo is to discuss the public reaction or non-reaction. Now, it could probably go two ways. On the one hand, we do see labor protests and medical personnel or teachers going out to the streets. Now, if you count the numbers and the widespread nature of it, then it's really limited. So in the memo, I discussed the nature of rather non-reaction to such sort of critical conditions growing in the regions. And I think the explanations are pretty clear that the wave, the patriotic wave, and the already discussed desire to fit into this sort of ideational field in Russia is one of the big explanations. But of course, I do come to similar conclusions that have been voiced at various sessions in PONARS, that the situation is so fragile that it's clear that the wave of popular frustration and grievances with social and economic conditions is on the increase. It is growing and it will continue to grow, because really, besides trying to more or less cleverly distribute the money that is obtained from selling oil and gas, no other innovative or breakthrough economic policies are there on the offer. So it's quite short-sighted solutions are on offer only. So maybe we can discuss further, but I think I'm out of time now.
Thank you so much. So that was a